Good morning and welcome. My name is Ivo Daalder and I'm the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thanks to you all and especially our members for joining us via Zoom for this on-the-record conversation with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Today's program is brought to you by the Lester Crown Center on U.S. Foreign Policy, which was established by a generous gift from the Crown family in support of all of the Council's work on U.S. foreign policy, including our annual Chicago Council Survey on Public Opinion. On another note, after we adjourn the conversation at 10:30, President Club Gold members and those above are invited to participate in our special question and answer session with Secretary Albright. If you're not a member at the level and would like to be more involved in our community and in these kinds of exclusive opportunities, we encourage you to reach out to our membership team. Now, turning directly to the speaker and the topic for today's program, I'm so very pleased to welcome Madeleine Albright back to the Council. As all of you know, Madeleine Albright was the 64th Secretary of State of the United States. Before her appointment, she also served as the permanent representative to the United Nations from 1993 to 1997. She's written a terrific new book entitled Hell and Other Destinations, a 21st century memoir in which she draws on her experiences over the past 2 decades and reflects on the later stages of what has been and continues to be a remarkable career. Please consider purchasing a copy of the book from our local Chicago book partner, The Bookseller. We'll also sharing a direct link for purchases in the chat function here on Zoom. In the meantime, a very warm welcome back to the Council, Madeleine. Always wonderful to have you, although I wish it were in person rather than by Zoom.
Well, Ivo, it's wonderful to be with you, and I wish I were in Chicago in person because it's a wonderful city, and the Council is great. So thank you very much for welcoming me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Well, it's always great to have you, even by Zoom. Talking about Zoom, how do you do a book tour in Zoom, and how well has it gone so far?
Well, I have to say that it has gone pretty well, but this is the problem. And you know this, I am an extrovert. I'm trying to learn to be an introvert. And an extrovert actually gets energy from the people that he or she is with. And while Zoom is good, I don't get the vibes. And so I'm very glad that Zoom exists, but I wish I were there in person.
Well, it's hard to play off the audience when the audience is not there physically in order to see it. So that's for sure. But wonderful to have at least the opportunity to have this discussion with you today about your book and about so many other things in your career. Let's start with the title, which I think comes from the now famous quote that there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. You also infer in the introduction of the book that it sometimes invokes the idea of to hell with it, why not? There is really no limit to what you can do. Can you elaborate a little bit about why you chose this as the title for this book?
Well, I did choose it because there are different versions of where hell is or how it has operated in literature and in a variety of myths. What I hadn't focused on, frankly, because I wrote the book before the virus, is how apt the title is now, because there are so many aspects of it that make sense. I think the thing that I wanted to do was to also focus on the other destinations, because when I left, as you know, I loved being Secretary of State, and all of a sudden it was over, and trying to figure out how I was going to do what I've always tried to do, which is to make whatever I'm doing next more interesting than what I did before. Not easy if you've been Secretary of State. So I have put together a life of many different destinations, and I can rationalize how it all goes together in terms of dot connection, and whatever activity I'm doing, I learn from that for another one. So when we were leaving, people said, well, you can teach, you can start a business, you can, and I had already been asked to be chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute. You can be involved with think tanks. you can give speeches. And I said yes to all of them. I didn't want to choose. That's what I'm doing. And that's what I write about, is how they all go together.
Well, it really is a remarkable set of activities that you pull together, and for well over 20 years now. In some ways, although you had a remarkable career as Secretary of State, your post-secretary career has been at least as remarkable and as outstanding. Reminds me of someone, a president you worked for in your first time in government, in the White House. Jimmy Carter is always known as a person whose post-presidency was at least as influential on the world as his presidency. And in some ways, what you're doing with NDI and with students at Georgetown, and of course with the business, continues to have real impact on what's happening. So it's a great testament of durability and persistence that is part of that. I wanted to get to the women part, because I think we're living in a time when we are seeing the remarkable sensibilities and capabilities that women leaders are bringing to the task of dealing with as difficult a challenge as the pandemic. And I think one of the things that stands out is that there are certain women leaders who've really taken on the task of this pandemic in ways that maybe some of our men leaders have not. Can you talk a little bit about what makes leadership in this particular moment so fraught, and where perhaps women are better suited for this, or not better, but are well suited for it?
Well, I do think it's remarkable as one looks at what's going on in the world, and where, in fact, there has been a better record in terms of dealing with the coronavirus and how the various decisions have been made. And frankly, it's quite a list, because we've seen Taiwan, we have seen Germany, New Zealand, which has been remarkable, Norway, Iceland, Finland. And I think that it's really interesting. And I've been asked the question of what makes women more capable or capable of dealing with this. And that, I think, is that, first of all, it took some difficulty to get to being a leader of a country. And in order to do it, I think that women figured out how to get along and to be really responsible and dependable and not so concerned about their egos on the way up. The other, I think, is that women, because we are forced to do this, is to multitask. We have a capability of doing that, and also having peripheral vision and being able to see what is happening around us. And then also, I do think a very apt aspect is that an awful lot of what's going on with the virus is taking care of people, which is what women do for the most part. And then also, when you have children, you want them actually to get along and not divide one group against another. So I can go through a variety of characteristics that make women capable of dealing with this, and those decisions are stunning, and being able to make them. I mean, I think the very young Prime Minister of New Zealand, she was remarkable already when there was a terrorist attack, and then also being capable of doing, of setting up a way of dealing with the issue. And Taiwan, that has had so many problems vis-a-vis their location and how they've been respected. So I think it's fascinating. And I happen, I'm often asked, do I think the world would be better if it were only run by women? I say, if you think that, you've forgotten high school. But I do think that it's important for men and women to work together to solve problems.
Well, clearly we are dealing with a situation where great leadership is demonstrated, and it is clear that a lot of women leaders have stood up in a way that we had wished everyone had stood up in this crisis. I want to take you back early on in the book, which you write about another place of hell. which was the war which you lived through in Britain at the time, having left Czechoslovakia because of the invasion by the Nazis, spending your childhood both in Czechoslovakia, but then later in Britain. How is that experience? Has that affected your way of thinking about the world? Perhaps also of thinking about what it is like to go through a crisis like the one we have today?
Well, again, as I say, I didn't know about the virus when I wrote the book, but just the way that you introduced us today this is the greatest crisis since World War II. And I was obviously a child, but what happened was my father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and he escaped to London with me and my mother, and he then continued to work for the government in exile in London. We lived through the Blitz in London, in Notting Hill Gate before it became fancy, and spent every night in the cellar. And I got used to singing 100 Green Bottles hanging on the wall, and spending a lot of time in air raid shelters. I have thought a lot about how my parents coped with all of this. And I think in retrospect, I'm sure they felt isolated. My mother didn't speak English. My father did. They were in a community they didn't know. And yet they managed to make the abnormal seem normal. And it made me realize the following thing, which is they had no control over the bombs and where they fell. The only thing they had control over was their behavior and their mood. And I think to a great extent, we're in a situation where most of us had nothing to do with how the virus started. We are learning a lot about it, and we do have to control our behavior and our mood. And so I think that there are lessons that come out of World War II. And then also trying to figure out what happens afterwards. And then I'm sick of using this cliche, but every crisis is an opportunity. And that is clearly, after World War II, the creation of an international system, which we have lived by since.
So let's talk a little bit about this international system. A remarkable, when you think about it in grand historical terms, 75 years of extraordinary great power peace. We've had no wars of the kind that really throughout history determined the future of much of what was happening, including, of course, in the first half of the 20th century in Europe and throughout the world. It was built on the basis of American victory in World War II and an American-led system. You and President Clinton talked about the indispensability of American leadership and power to make that system work. We're seemingly at the end of the system. We are moving into a different and new world, and perhaps this crisis will determine where that world is going to. How do you look back at where we have been? What were the ingredients of success? And how would you try to hold on to those as we think about how to get through the crisis and then into our new post-COVID world, which hopefully one day we will enter?
Well, I do think that as the UN was established, it was remarkable in terms of the cooperation of major leaders trying to figure out what had created the horror show that was World War II, understanding the weaknesses of the League of Nations, and really having people involved in writing the charter and then carrying it out at the UN at a very hard time, frankly, when whatever friendship and alliance we'd had with the Soviet Union during the war dissipated, the whole rise of a communist China, any number of different aspects. But there was a way that the system, in many ways, continued to be based on sovereignty and the nation state and how to figure out how to work together. Now, I have said that people and institutions in their 70s need a little refurbishing. And the UN is 75 years old. This is their anniversary. And I think there are issues that need to be dealt with. in terms of how the system operates. But changes won't come if, in fact, we don't work together on it. And one of the aspects, again, very specifically at the moment, has to do with the coronavirus, because there are questions about how the World Health Organization works. There are questions about America's participation in trying to solve the problems. And I think that there are lessons that come out of what happened after World War II that can be applied. And so one of the aspects, and also, as you pointed out, I was there at a certain point, and it was right after the Cold War, and it was an amazing time to be there. And President Clinton did use the term indispensable, but there's nothing about the word indispensable that says alone. It means that we need to be engaged. And for me, it's partnerships, and that's what needs to happen. I do think that the UN now needs to figure out the role of the private sector, the non-governmental organizations and corporations that need to be at the table earlier. But I think the most counterproductive thing, and there have been quite a few that have been done, is for us to say that we will not pay to be in the World Health Organization, because when we create a vacuum, there are countries that will step in, and China already has. And I'm sure we can talk more about that. But I think we can't, and again, another cliche, if the UN didn't exist, we would invent it now, because we need cooperation. The virus knows no borders.
China, you mentioned, of course, has already, well before this crisis and continued through this crisis, used whatever opportunity it could find, whatever vacuum in leadership or engagement it saw, and tried to fill it, including into the UN, where there are now more senior Chinese diplomats in the UN than there are American senior diplomats. We are seeing a competition with China. Between the United States and China, between a democratic and authoritarian system, between two great powers politically, militarily, which we haven't really seen since the Cold War. This may not be a new Cold War, but it is a competition between great powers. How should we think about that competition today and going forward? Should we look at it in the kind of zero-sum terms that you often hear in Washington debates on both sides of the aisle? Or is there, in fact, still room for cooperation to build a more cooperative and peaceful order in which competition gets channeled towards dealing with the problems like the virus and others that we all have in common? How do you look at this relationship?
Well, I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in since I left office that have something to do with China, the rising power, and trying to figure out how we operate with it. And when the Obama administration, quote, rebalanced to Asia, because I've said many times the U.S. is not monogamous. We're an Atlantic power and a Pacific power. And so there are important aspects of what the U.S. can and should do in Asia, and also how we operate generally internationally. I think that the art of statecraft that you've been involved in, that we've done together, is in fact being able to figure out where we cooperate with a country on joint issues and where we compete. And it's possible to do both. I do think the Chinese have a lot to explain with how the virus started and the lack of control over it and all the lack of transparency. But there are an awful lot of issues that we have to deal with them, some to do with navigational rights and some where you don't have to be a genius to figure out that you need them on multilateral issues like climate change, nuclear proliferation, and health issues. And a perfect example for me is if the Chinese were now to be able to develop a vaccine, would we say no, that we didn't want anything to do with it? So I think that logic demands that we state our case very clearly. We make clear that their human rights record is abominable, that there are problems to do with Hong Kong and Taiwan, but also that there are areas that we could find some cooperation on. I am concerned about their strategy, which is the Belt and Road initiatives. And I keep saying the Chinese must be getting fatter and fatter because the belt is getting larger. And I think that we have to be very watchful. And it states very clearly, which is why the United States cannot be AWOL internationally.
I want to talk about some of the high points after you left office, and one of them was a visit you made with President Clinton to Pristina, to Kosovo, and of course your and the administration's intervention in Kosovo to stop the extraordinary ethnic cleansing that was occurring in 1998 and 1999 are well known. But you spend a lot of your time as both UN ambassador and then as Secretary of State on the Balkans, a time with an area where hell truly was present. And I think it was Warren Christopher who termed it the problem from hell. But you were always determined to take that problem and find a way to fix it, and spent a good part of your time in the Clinton administration doing so until the success in Kosovo. Tell us a little bit about that history, and then also what it was like to be in Pristina with Bill Clinton to celebrate the end of that war and the success of it.
Well, let me just say, my life has really been a lot of accidents and very interesting aspects. And who would have thought, after we left England, after the war, we were in Prague for a while, and then my father was made the Czechoslovak ambassador to Yugoslavia. The little girl in the national costume that gave flowers at the airport, that's what I did for a living. I understand Serbo-Croatian, and I know an awful lot about the history of the Balkans because I was the perfect daughter and still am, even though he's long gone. And so the idea that I had anything to do with the Balkans is kind of interesting in itself. And you and I spent a lot of time doing things together, and you do know how frustrated I was that we weren't able to do things in Bosnia earlier. And any number of reasons for that. But then all of a sudden I'm Secretary of State and I see what's been happening in Kosovo. And I felt very strongly that we needed to stop ethnic cleansing there and the genocidal killings that were going on. And it was interesting in terms of, first of all, how the Secretary of State can say anything but has no airplanes, and how the decision-making was done. But what was the most incredible thing was that we had a war, we ended it, and then there were a variety of agreements. And what happened was President Clinton and I went there for the 20th anniversary of the end of the war. And I had been to Pristina right after the war, and there already were all kinds of thank you signs. But when we went 20 years later, I have never been to a place that was so appreciative of what we had done. And there were hundreds of flags and thousands of people out. And it was really a very big moment to be able to be there with President Clinton. We walked through the town together. He's got a very large statue dedicated to him. And they had one of me. Fortunately, it was on a pedestal, so I didn't look 3 inches tall. But we also stopped by a memorial to the peacekeeping forces and understood the importance of help from the outside to Kosovo, which, by the way, they continue to need. And I do think one of the lessons about the U.S. and our role is, as Americans, we have a tendency to kind of check a box and say we've done that. Problems go on. There needs to be continued partnership and working there in order for that country and the people there who want to be independent to have that independence. But people ask me what I'm proudest of as Secretary of State. It really is Kosovo. And even though there were lots of problems there at the beginning and things went wrong and it was called Madeleine's War, not as a compliment. When we won, other people took some credit. But the bottom line is I love going there. There's a whole generation of young women there whose first name is Madeleine.
Well, and deservedly so. And as you say, most Americans probably don't know, but there's still American troops in Kosovo today, helping to keep the peace. And they've been doing it for a very long time in a place where thousands were slaughtered. Whatever the big political differences that still remain in the country, that's not happening anymore. And I think it's testament to strong American and global engagement. Many other countries were part of it as well and continue to be part of it.
And I have to say, you played a very important role in it. We spent a lot of time dealing with each other when we are in the administration, and then later the whole NATO role and everything else. And I think that what is so important, if I may say so, is that the U.S. government needs people that understand national security policy, that have a deep interest in it, that have a capability of working together to solve problems, and having the capability of disagreeing in order to come up with the best possible solution. And I do think that it is essential to understand the importance of things that happen in foreign countries and how they affect the United States.
Well, I think as one of your predecessors once said, diplomacy is like gardening. You have to get your hands dirty, go in there and understand what's happening. And it's very hard to engage in that when you don't understand the countries you're dealing with. So that's certainly something you've done and others have extraordinarily well. I wanted to come to one of my favorite phrases that you've used, because I think that it takes a European background to say something like this, which says that you're an optimist, which is your American heritage, who worries a lot. And I think that's an apt phrase. We can talk a lot about what worries you, but what are you optimistic about?
Well, I am optimistic about the next generation, among other things. I do teach, and I have loved teaching at Georgetown. I taught in the 80s, and then I was honored to be asked to come back to teach. And I have spent an awful lot of time with this young generation that is very, interestingly enough, capable of dealing with a lot of the technology issues and what it brings to them and information, and their capability of identifying with people in other countries and speaking a lot of different languages. And I have we've just finished the semester, and I have been very inspired by the young people. Robert Frost always has great quotes, but one that I love is something like, "The older I am, the younger are my teachers." And I can certainly say that in terms of this generation, of how they see things, how they're going to cope. We are not going to go back to the pre-coronavirus moments. We are going to be living in a different world. We need to understand the historical context, but we need to move forward. So I am very much optimistic about our younger generation. I was recently at an event where I was asked to describe myself in 6 words. So a worried optimist, a problem solver, and a grateful American. And they do all go together.
Well, that's a wonderful way to look at the world, and I think you've given so much back. In fact, you've done it all. You've been you are an author, you're an advisor, you're a businesswoman, you continue to be a consultant, a professor, a board member, a former diplomat, and always continuing diplomat. You've even apparently been a drummer at a major performance at the Kennedy Center, which we really want to hear about that. But you've done done a lot. You've enjoyed your post-government afterlife. Many people finish government, then they go to the beach and maybe write a memoir, and that's it. But you haven't. And so the question arrives, what's next? Or are you ever going to retire?
No, but by the way, I really, I'm often asked, how do I want to be remembered? And I said, I want to be remembered. I'm still here. And it took me a long time to find my voice, and I want to use my voice to really push and persuade about the things that I care deeply about. And democracy is obviously a major one. And I'm very troubled to see the kinds of things that are coming out in terms of democracy abroad, how it is under threat from authoritarianism. And I think there's an awful lot that has to be done. I look forward to doing it with you, frankly, because the council, you've just done very terrific things in terms of Chicago and your real interest in everything. And I hope that we can continue to have ways of talking. You've done such great surveys. I just think they're fantastic. And I've used them in class and also in terms of the way that I look at things. And I have to say the Crown family is remarkable in what they've done. And so I'm very glad to be a part of whatever you're doing.
Well, that's terrific. Thanks so much for those very kind words and for the council. Our survey is going to go in the field in a few weeks for 2020, and we'll be looking forward to the results and to see how the crisis has or has not affected how Americans look at the world. Madeleine, Madam Secretary, it's always wonderful to speak with you. It's great to see you. Hopefully, we will see you in Chicago in the not too distant future. Before we adjourn, I want to let people know that as a reminder that if you are a President Club Gold member or higher and have registered, we'll shortly reconvene on Zoom at the second meeting link that was sent to you for an exclusive question and answer session. You should have received all the details in email. But just to emphasize, you'll have to click a second link before you are able to join that meeting. Again, Madam Secretary, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.